and I'll probably be talking about that again this evening on this bill. But the reality is, people have promoted the big lie that somehow Donald Trump actually won the election that we know that he lost last year.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Ranchier, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for some questions?
The gentleman is out of time.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I ask you vote no on the resolution.
The chair recognizes Mr. Bucy to speak against the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I want to first thank Chairman Turner, who just walked us through so many terrible things in this resolution that's before us. I want to really sink down into one section that he closed with. But that's how important it is. I see everyone's on their cell phones and reading other things, and I think it's important that we think about what we're about to vote on. This is a section that was added. We're going outside of the bounds. That means that we never had this in either the Senate bill or the House bill. There's 150 of us on this floor, but it's not 150 people that we represent. We represent 29 million Texans. When we walk around with the impact of almost 200,000 people for each of us here. 29 million Texans whose voice are about to be hindered at the ballot box if we pass this resolution. Section 232.063 on page 15, it says overturning election. If the number of votes illegally cast in the election is equal to or greater than the number of votes necessary to change the outcome of an election, the court may declare the election void without attempting to determine how individual voters voted. What does that mean? This adds an entirely new section that makes it easier to overturn an election previously. Previously, those seeking to overturn an election were required to show that the alleged fraud actually resulted in a fraudulent win. The new provision lowers the threshold to simply require evidence that alleged fraud could have resulted in a fraudulent win, meaning you no longer have to prove it. So all of you out there, as myself, we all have political enemies. They could use this to overthrow the voice of the people, to overthrow the voice of Texans. You're not one person when you're here. You're almost 200,000 people. You're the voice of Texas. Do we want to throw out our ability to let the voices be heard through elections? Because if we pass this resolution, we no longer have to prove voter fraud to throw out an election result. We can simply do it.
Mr. Speaker?
Ms. Gonzalez, for a
Does the
purpose?
gentleman yield for some questions?
Gentleman yield for questions?
I do.
He yields.
Representative Bucy, there were some amendments when SB 7 got voted out on the House floor that were agreed upon, right, and voted out of this body.
That's correct.
And were these amendments stripped out in the final version of the bill?
I think many of them were.
Do you know why that was?
No idea.
In fact, would you agree with me that the bill came back worse?
Not only did the bill come back worse, and I think this is what's so important as we talk about this resolution, it's not that the bill is just worse. It's not just that our side versus your side doesn't agree with it. It's that this resolution is adding stuff that we never heard, that we never debated, that we never got to have our constituents come and testify on. This resolution goes outside the bounds of what we dealt with. That means the voices of Texans were not heard in this debate.
And so would you agree that the process circumvented the opportunity for people to be able to give their testimony in committee?
You know, absolutely. Going outside the bounds may be within the rules, but it's our job, I think, to do this in the clear of day where our constituents get to have their voice heard. And this resolution did not give that opportunity to our constituents.
So the people deserve to have a public hearing on this, and we deserve to have that before it getting put into this final piece of legislation that was done behind doors, right?
Absolutely.
But did you have an opportunity to review, have time to review?
I mean, I think the Senate got this late last night, if I remember, based on what I was hearing over there. This is a 20-page outside the bounds resolution. We heard Chairman Turner talk. I don't know when we've seen something that big to really process it for the 150 of us to have the time to process that. I think the time has been short. I think I can speak for the whole body of the House that this isn't the bill the House sent over. This resolution takes it way beyond that, and I don't think that was the intent of Republican or Democrat on this floor to have this resolution here.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Rain, Chair, for purpose.
will the gentleman yield for questions?
The gentleman yield for questions.
Yes, sir.
He yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the provision, particularly among all of the offensive provisions of SB 7, one of them that we are now seeing for the first time is changing the evidentiary standard and the process for overturning elections, which a judge can do over the will of the people. And you talked about that in your layout. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
And so I just want to highlight for you, and you're probably aware of this since you've followed this process for a while, that we have multiple members whom at least I've served with that have been seated in this body after special masters have heard their cases. And if I can walk some of those through those with you, I'm sure you're familiar with the names. But
I'd love to know more.
Hubert Vo, who's in my class, won by 16 votes out of 50,000 votes. And there were rampant allegations by his opponent of voter fraud in the Vietnamese community. And a special master was convened in this body, and the evidentiary standard was not only that they had to prove that the margin of victory, there were votes that exceeded the margin of victory that had been called into question, and they said there were about 450 or 500 fraudulent votes, but they also had to prove that those votes would have been for a representative vote. And do you know what the outcome of that special master's convening was?
I don't, and I think we all need to be reminded.
So the outcome is that Hubert Vo is here today as a member of the legislature because there was one fraudulent vote that was found by Special Master Hartnett, who's a Republican from Dallas County. And do you know what that vote showed?
What did it show?
It showed that a non-citizen had voted, but he wasn't Vietnamese, he was Norwegian. Okay. And that person had voted straight ticket Republican. Wow. And so despite all of the allegations, and in this bill we're changing the evidentiary standard for that, and suddenly he's saying a judge can overturn an election just by the allegations of votes in excess of the margin of victory. And I find that troubling, and I hope you do too.
Well, and to understand what you're saying under this new standard, Hubert Vo, elected by his constituents to be here and to fight for them, may have been thrown out.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Same thing happened in the case of Donner Howard, who won an election by 4 votes of 50,000 cast. And there were widespread allegations of voter fraud there as well. And when they convened a special master, you know how many votes they found that were fraudulent? 0.
0. But under this new standard, crying and making accusations could get us thrown out of office, that we were elected.
And I received a text from my longtime desk mate, Mark Strama of Austin, who had beaten Jack Stick when in 2004, and we all came in together, and the evidentiary standard that was used by the special master, also Will Hartnett in that case, was that they had to show not only that the margin of victory, those 500 votes that Mark Strama won by, were fraudulent, he actually also had to show that those votes were for him. And Mark Strama, who served with distinction in this body for 10 years, would not have been seated had we used the evidentiary standard in this bill. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that's a big problem. That subverts democracy. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Members, this resolution will take away the people's voice. It will allow your elections to be overturned because of political enemies. Please vote no on this resolution.
Mr. Reynolds, for what purpose?
Would the gentleman yield for some questions?
The gentleman yield for
Absolutely.
questions. He yields.
Mr. Bucy, you served on the Elections Committee, correct?
That's correct.
And you've served on the Elections Committee prior to this session, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And you understand that the out-of-bounds resolution changes the timeline on when people can vote the Sunday before Election Day. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it's disappointing. It's going to be detrimental, and it's going to really impact souls to the polls.
And when you talk about the souls to the polls, well, first of all, was that even discussed earlier, or when did we first see this new change of the time period on Sunday voting that you couldn't vote before 1 p.m.? When did you first see that?
I think it was in the last 24 hours or so that we first saw
So
this.
there was no vetting of that. Is that not correct?
That's correct. There was no vetting. There was no constituent input.
And in fact, it is clear based upon prior election cycles that African Americans tend to utilize the souls to the polls. Is that your understanding?
That's correct.
And it is your understanding that this would have a likely disparate impact among Black, Latino voters of color in the state of Texas. Is that your understanding?
Absolutely.
And is it also your understanding that Texas increased significantly in the 2020 election cycle for early voting in person, through mail, and that the souls to the polls was a big factor in the African American turnout?
That's correct.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Please vote no.
Chair recognizes Ms. Johnson of Dallas to speak against the resolution.